right, good evening, everyone. I don't have a glass to get everybody's attention, but my name is David Reingold. I'm the dean here in the College of Liberal Arts. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's lecture and to Purdue University if you happen to be from another campus. It's a real sort of milestone for us as we try and sort of kickstart our effort that got started this fall with Cornerstone. And one of the things that I guess I wanted to just say as I introduce our introducer, Professor Kane, is, you know, in the humanities, the social sciences, and the arts, we have been faced with a number of challenges over the recent past. And chief among them are not our intellectual spirit and our creative work, but around student interest and student demand. Obviously here at Purdue and many other universities, we have seen students leave our majors, leave our classes. Some universities, it's been steeper than others. It's been particularly steep here at Purdue University. And we also face the sort of public narrative challenge of sort of questioning our value and our role in university life. And so as we have sort of struggled with this here, and others have struggled with it, you know, we are working on a number of fronts, and one of them is this Cornerstone program, this integrated liberal arts program, is one of the ways here that we are trying to address these questions and these challenges. And I'm mindful it's, you know, one strategy, and I'm hopeful over the years there'll be a number of strategies that will sort of unfold and that we will be able to pursue, and we'll sort of look back on this period as a period of experimentation and hopeful a period of revival as we move forward. So, you know, we've gathered this group, very excited to be able to be a part of it, to support Melinda Zook and her efforts, brilliant efforts here leading the program, all of our Cornerstone Fellows who are thrilled that you've decided to be a part of this effort, and to sort of try and generate our collective wisdom and to lean on your expertise in helping us think through what we're doing, share a little bit about what we're doing, learn a little bit about what you've been doing at other institutions as well, and advance the conversation. We're grateful for financial support from the Teagle Foundation, who has helped us in this effort here this evening and tomorrow. So with that, I'm delighted to be here, and I'm delighted to introduce Professor Kane from philosophy.
Thank you, David. One of my teachers, Alistair McIntyre, once said, channeling Aristotle, I think, human beings cannot flourish without some understanding of who and what we are and what we are doing. And such an understanding must come from learning. So what's learning? Michael Oakeshott once said that learning is coming to understand and respond to some particular substantive expressions of thought and inquiries and investigations and emotions, some particular substantive expressions of thought as invitations to think and to believe. In these invitations, Oakeshott said, we find a language rich in fine distinctions which we can use to think for ourselves. Well, in taking up some of these invitations in the humanities and in the sciences, we can develop learning how to think well and to live well in our own time. And if this is what the liberal arts are about, a revival is probably needed every now and again. Reviving the liberal arts might involve three things. First, revitalizing the liberal arts in our scholarship. Second, regenerating interest in the liberal arts at our universities and in society. And third, reproducing the liberal arts, giving birth to the liberal arts in a new generation of students. So revitalizing, regenerating, and reproducing. It's quite fitting, I think, that Mark Roach is here to help us this evening because he's been devoted and accomplished in all three areas for quite a long time. First, in his scholarship. Since 1996, Mark has been the Reverend Edmund P. Joyce Professor of German Language and Literature at the University of Notre Dame, after 12 distinguished years at the Ohio State University. Mark is the author of 9 books, with 6 more planned, and several dozen scholarly articles, beginning in German literature with Schiller, Hölderlin, and Hegel, and ranging into philosophy, literary theory, aesthetics, and cinema. To take just one example, his 2004 book, Why Literature Matters in the 21st Century, has been described as, quote, a challenging and provocative study of wide-ranging interests and daunting erudition, unquote. But the reviewer continued, when Mark Roach expatiates on the beauty of nature, he succeeds in conveying a sense of its total otherness, its rich emotional value, independent of its utility to our survival as a species. When he then relates this intrinsic value, by way of analogy, to the potential of an ideal artwork, he manages, for a moment at least, he manages to overcome years of critical training and praxis that impel many of us to view reality, and therefore also art, as essentially a social construct. Roach creates a hunger in the reader for an aesthetics that would accommodate this experience. He stokes that appetite in a philosophical tour de force, unquote. And that's just one book, and that inspired quite a review, I would say. So, revitalizing the liberal arts. In his academic leadership, he has accomplished much. From 1997 to 2008, Mark was the I.A. O'Shaughnessy Dean of the College of Arts and Letters at the University of Notre Dame, where he has been a passionate advocate for the liberal arts at Notre Dame and across the nation and in Germany. His book, Why Choose the Liberal Arts, in 2010, is an award-winning book on the liberal arts. His 2017 book, Realizing the Distinctive University, reflects on his experiences as a dean. While at Notre Dame, Mark risked profaning the sacred, I think, when he created a public lecture series scheduled for 3 hours before kickoff on Notre Dame football Saturdays. The Saturday Scholar Series, since 2001, has served to reconnect Notre Dame alums to their education and their continuing education. And I think that's quite admirable in advocating for the liberal arts at the university and in society. And third, reproducing the liberal arts in his own teaching. I can testify to this. In 1996, I was a returning graduate student at Notre Dame, returning from a year in Tübingen, Germany, on a Fulbright, working on my German and working on my dissertation. And my advisor, Karl Amrichs, subtly remarked to me that there was at the time a new German department head just come in from Ohio State, and he had some Tübingen ties, and so I might audit his class to keep up on my German. And I did so, and that was Mark Roach. I audited his class on German literature since Lessing, and it was a terrific class, I can say, and for 2 reasons. First, it was a really well thought out course. The readings he chose fit together well, and he had an idea of how we could work through them. The second reason it was a great class was because Mark always said as little as possible in class. He was a great leader of discussion. In fact, I think it was a sort of a twist on a Franciscan motto. It was something like, teach the liberal arts, use words if necessary. But it worked. My fellow students and I spoke, engaged the texts, and Mark guided us along the way. Then he became dean, and as dean, he continued to teach regularly. And after his time as dean, he decided he wanted to return to the classroom and create his own year-long honors seminar, ranging from Homer to Boethius in the fall semester and Dante to Woody Allen in the spring. And this is the part I really like. One of his 6 learning goals for this course, quote, students will develop various intellectual virtues essential to a flourishing community of learning. Virtues such as temperance, modesty, justice, intellectual hospitality, diplomacy, courage, honesty, perseverance, patience, curiosity, and wonder, unquote. How do you assess all that? I'm not sure, but as a former dean, you can probably get away with that. But Mark in his teaching introduces a new generation of students to these invitations to think, to believe, and he empowers them to do so. How has he managed to juggle all this in his career? Truth of the matter, he went to clown school. Quite literally, he says in his book, he made beer money living in Tübingen as a grad student by juggling in the streets. He's accomplished in many areas. Revitalizing the liberal arts, regenerating the liberal arts, and reproducing the liberal arts. And that's why I'm honored to present my friend, Mark Roach, Making the Case for the Liberal Arts.
Thank you so much, Patrick. That was a very kind and warm and thoughtful introduction. I appreciate it very much. I'm delighted to be at Purdue. As Patrick said, I spent the first 12 years of my career at Ohio State, and whenever I'm at a Big Ten university, a part of me feels very much at home. Patrick also mentioned that I served as dean for more than a decade, and I still remember my first day in the office. The phone rings. The provost had the direct line to the dean's desk and said, "Roach, what does being a dean have in common with being a groundskeeper at a cemetery?" There are a lot of people under you, but no one is listening. I'm happy today, in contrast, to have such an attentive audience. I went to Williams College, and my wife went to Bowdoin College, both liberal arts colleges. So we've long been passionate supporters of the liberal arts. And this morning at breakfast, I said to my wife, in your wildest dreams, did you imagine that I would be invited to various campuses to make the case for the liberal arts? She smiled, looked up from her coffee, and said, "Mark, you're not even in my wildest dreams." What do I mean by the liberal arts? I mean the arts and sciences as opposed to professional fields such as business and nursing. The arts and the sciences are the heirs of the traditional 7 liberal arts: grammar, rhetoric, dialectic, geometry, arithmetic, music, and astronomy. The liberal arts ideal entails the goal of educating the whole person by immersing him or her in courses across the arts and sciences. Every Purdue undergraduate receives, by way of your broad-based core curriculum, a liberal arts education. However, those who major in the liberal arts and those who participate in your new program, the Cornerstone Integrated Liberal Arts, will receive a deeper liberal arts education. I'd like to begin by telling you why I wrote this book, Why Choose the Liberal Arts. Then I'll summarize some of the main arguments, adding a few new reflections, and circling back occasionally to your new initiative in the Cornerstone Integrated Liberal Arts. Why did I write such a book? There were 3 immediate catalysts. First, when I was dean at Notre Dame, we experienced rising numbers of majors in business. The book developed out of the story I was trying to tell students, and especially parents, in response to their question whether a major in philosophy or art history would allow them to get a job. I wanted to make the case to parents and students that a liberal arts background could meet their practical concerns. Addresses by administrators may attempt to answer this puzzle, but they tend to be brief, abstract, and infrequent. I wanted to give a fuller response. Second, although I could recognize this practical value, I was disturbed by the ways in which the purpose of higher education was being reduced to merely practical ends. College was simply a means to an end, and not also an end in itself. Related, the national debate on undergraduate education had been and continues to be overwhelmingly about job preparation. Further, according to surveys of first-year students or students entering college, they want above all to be very well off financially. That ambition is the most prominent, whereas a generation ago, developing a meaningful philosophy of life was the highest ambition of students entering college. Third was my sense that the idea of a moral education was disappearing from the landscape of American higher education. Faculty tend to focus on disciplinary learning and critical thinking. I thought we could do more and should not relegate character and the development of virtues to residential life. Those were the three immediate catalysts. Along the way, I expanded the scope so that the book would appeal not only to students and parents, but also to faculty members and administrators. And I wanted it to be useful not only to liberal arts majors and their parents, but also to students in other fields who are required to take certain courses in the liberal arts. The first chapter is entitled Engaging the Great Questions. Students come to college with meaningful questions, and college awakens more. How did planets form, and how did life on Earth arise? How does the mind work? What does it mean to be human? What were the great turning points in history? What makes a war just? What are the great artworks of the ages? Why do some developing countries stagnate and others flourish? What are our generation's most pressing moral obligations? What is the meaning of death? Education should be relevant, but there is much that is relevant beyond what is practical. Few such questions have practical value in the truncated way in which we tend to define practical value, but they do matter to students to understand our world as it is and as it should be, our values in and of themselves. Commonly, we speak of the big questions. While big justly captures the idea that these are far-reaching, far-ranging questions that transcend individual disciplines, it suggests only a quantitative dimension. I prefer the term great questions, which captures also their profound and ennobling quality. What makes a question great? Some questions are simply more fundamental than other more focused questions. What is the value of studying history? What makes an interpretation valid? Other questions are more important in a hierarchy of values. They are normatively privileged. What is the highest good? What obligations do we owe future generations? What kinds of learning are most important for students? Other questions are intriguing not only for their normative value, but also for their complexity. To answer them, we must draw on the insights of multiple disciplines. How do we solve the environmental crisis? How can we reduce violence and war? How can we best improve education? Others are great because they are existentially pressing for many or for the person asking the question. Why is evil so fascinating to us and so difficult to combat? What moves and motivates me? What is the purpose of my life? I begin the syllabus for every course I teach with a paragraph or two on the fascinating questions the course explores. That is, the intrinsic value of the subject, including its connection to great questions. I do this even for German language courses. I want to capture the students' interest and motivation and let the questions guide the entire course. I suspect if you took any of your courses, or for that matter, any of your faculty research projects or student papers, and pushed the topics to their ultimate implications, you could come up with a great question. The cornerstone themes you have chosen at Purdue are filled with great questions. For example, how do technological advancements intersect with human values? How will we tackle the problems of substance abuse? What are the implications of a global economy? How have civil authorities either succeeded or failed to achieve humanity's best interests? I frequently teach a year-long course for first-year students, taking them from Homer to Dante in the fall and Machiavelli to Woody Allen in the spring. Sometimes the texts change, the endpoints change. One of the goals is for students to learn how to ask great questions as part of a lifelong process of continual learning. Toward the end of the year, I ask each student to compose a list of 10 or more great questions on which the students want to reflect further. The lists are quite rich. Inviting students not only to provide answers, but also to ask further questions combines two pedagogical principles: active learning and existential engagement. Moreover, it fosters the habit of continuing to ask questions which can be meaningful beyond any one class and beyond college itself. Although contemporary society has little patience for such questions, and for what it sees as the apparent idleness of learning for its own sake, the college experience is for many students a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to ask deep questions without being overwhelmed by the distractions of everyday life, material needs, and practical applications. College, with its focus not only on the everyday, but also on the transcendent, its engagement as much with the past as the present, is an oasis of difference in our culture. We should not be ashamed of that. To think of alternatives, we need to step back from the present and the everyday. We commonly reduce what is valuable to what is worthy, what is valuable or worthy to what we call useful. But the useful is useful only insofar as it serves other ends. What is or should be even more valuable than the useful is what we value as its own end: the exploration of nature, knowledge of the social world, engagement with art and literature, contemplation, dialogue, friendship, and love. When education is reduced to the practical, the question, how do I achieve this or that end, is valued over the higher order questions. What end should I pursue? Which are more interesting and which are more worthy? Modernity tends to underappreciate this concept of intrinsic value, being so gripped by substantive works and so immersed in great questions that we lose ourselves in them and temporarily ignore the external world tends to be an activity reserved for college alone and then viewed with suspicion. Learning for its own sake is often scoffed at as being only for the wealthy. Not really. It is for those who are interested in ideas and are willing to devote time to the great questions. For 20 years now, residents of the South Bend Center for the Homeless have engaged in discussions of great works with faculty members from my university. Reading their statements about how inspired they were by reading Sophocles and the Socratic dialogues, how it affected them to the core, is a moving experience. If we believe that practical needs must always trump the intrinsic value of intellectual pursuits, we impoverish ourselves. Such a view can be patronizing when a contrary approach that awakens intellectual development can be empowering. The value of the intrinsic and the non-instrumental is partly manifest in college friendships, which over time can become among our longest-lasting friendships. Aristotle famously said, excuse me, even though I have it on mute, this is the time to bring in the horses at night. Somehow I forgot to turn that off. My wife has it too, so she's at home. She'll take care of that. Now, back to Aristotle. Aristotle famously said that the highest friendships are based not on pleasure or utility. In the highest form of friendship, we cultivate in one another what is the highest potential of humanity and the highest activity of the soul, goodness and intelligence. Such friendships are ends in themselves. The intrinsic value of college friendships arises out of shared experiences, including an engagement with the great questions, whose primary purpose is not utility, but meaning. To help foster intellectual friendships, I try my best to ensure that students spend time together outside of class. In most of my discussion classes, I lead the first 7 or 8 classes, but then students in teams of 2 prepare the pre-reading questions and co-lead the discussions. We often begin with small discussion groups of 4 or 5, and then we move to the plenary setting. Everybody is thereby actively engaged in a more intimate setting. Students go in groups of 2 to 4 to the museum to look at paintings and write together after they've had a common discussion, a 1-page paper in advance of our collective visit to the museum. I meet with students informally over lunch or invite them to my home for dinner, an activity we find so valuable at Notre Dame that I was able to secure funding from an external donor to endow the program, which creates an incentive for faculty to engage students in this way. Students in groups of 2 or 3 video themselves in conversation about our works and questions that we ask in class, and then analyze the conversations to assess their own performance in writing, both the quality of the content and the various nonverbal dimensions, as well as how they spoke. Your focus here at Purdue on core themes that will interest students across majors is certainly conducive to fostering the kind of intellectual friendships that can be cultivated in the classroom and beyond. The second chapter is called Cultivating Intellectual and Practical Virtues. Some goods that have intrinsic value are also useful for extrinsic purposes. The idea that something can be both a means and an end is complex, but hardly contradictory. The concept was introduced already by Plato, who draws the distinction in Republic II, recognizing that, quote, there is a kind of good which we would choose to possess, not from desire for its after effects, but welcome it for its own sake, end of quote. Plato then argues that a number of goods satisfy both components. There is a kind we love both for its own sake and for its consequences. The power of sight, for example, gives us immediate pleasure, but it also allows us to do many other things, from undertaking crafts to navigating the world. A liberal arts education likewise fulfills both moments. It is its own reward and superb preparation for the life of work. This practical argument is most persuasive to students and their parents today. What is the practical value of the liberal arts? I'd like you now to take about 30 seconds to reflect on what formal virtues or capacities students most develop in a liberal arts environment. Reflect on the classes you teach. Reflect on the classes you took, for some of you, as for me, many years ago. What skills and capacities did you obtain that serve you well, whatever career path you have chosen? Then share your reflections with your neighbor. Have you uncovered anything in common? About 30 seconds. Think about it, chat with your neighbor. Please. Well, 30 seconds are up. I'm sorry to interrupt. A very animated discussion. It's obviously a topic that lends itself. We need David's glass and spoon, I think. I suspect that much of what you discussed is central to the learning goals of Cornerstone courses, especially your transformative text classes. For example, writing and speaking with clarity and precision, thinking critically and creatively, and assimilating and analyzing information. The first focus I have in this chapter is communication. Year after year, communication skills rank usually first, sometimes second, in the Job Outlook National Survey of employers hiring on college campuses. Not surprisingly, the demand for communication skills only increases as one ascends in rank. In such settings, one must speak to people beyond one's area of specialization. And to lead others, one must be able to find the words to motivate them, an exercise that transcends technical competence. At Notre Dame, oral communication was to some degree insufficiently addressed. When we reviewed a contested course at Notre Dame that was supposed to be taught in discussion format, we surveyed both students and faculty on aspects of the course. When we asked, was the majority of class time devoted to discussion or lecture, the students said it was mainly lecture, and the faculty members said it was mainly discussion. When we introduced a new course requirement, now more than 10 years ago, we asked 3 questions. First, how do we define a liberally educated person today? What characteristics does such a person have? Second, what are the greatest gaps our students have in the light of that ideal? Finally, what courses will help students approximate our educational ideal and overcome their existing weaknesses? By focusing on the educational ideal and on our students' gaps, we were able to take off the table the transdisciplinary interests that sometimes drive curricular discussions. We introduced a new course, the college seminar, where oral skills are front and center. The seminar places an emphasis on discussion and other activities that help students develop their capacities for oral expression and intellectual agility, with no less than 2/3 of the grade based on oral contributions, oral performance. Because a student can't speak well without first having thought deeply, in my version of the course, students must write in advance of every single class. The students take a 30-minute one-on-one, a midterm oral examination, and a 45-minute one-on-one final oral examination. For each exam, the student receives a page of written comments, which I dictate immediately after we meet. For most students, it's a wonderful learning opportunity. The students receive extensive feedback, totaling about 5 pages of single-space comments by the end of the semester. These range from praise for specific comments and diverse kinds of contributions to suggested strategies for improvement and the recommendation that they overcome their use of specific filler words such as like, you know, or During the classes led by students, I speak only occasionally, such that it's much easier for me to make notes about student contributions and offer nurturing feedback. The students also receive peer feedback. Well into the semester, I ask every student to offer a sentence of praise and a constructive suggestion for every other student in the class. A staff person processes the comments so that each student receives a page of anonymous praise and a page of anonymous suggestions. The peer comments are often hugely insightful and usually reinforce one another as well as my own feedback. At times, students are quite severe on nonverbals, while positive comments are occasionally quoted in my letters of recommendation, sometimes 4 years later. This helpful exercise can be achieved only in the kind of smaller discussion classes that you have in your first-year Cornerstone seminars. Superb writing skills are no less essential. The book Academically Adrift by Richard Aram and Josipa Roxa makes clear that undergraduate business majors, for example, do not make the same level of gains as arts and sciences students in complex reasoning, critical thinking, and effective writing, and that the main reason for this limited learning, they hypothesize, is the fewer hours business students invest in studying, including studying alone, which involves extensive reading, writing, and rewriting. Majors in other fields need these liberal arts courses, and students in the liberal arts have a certain advantage when it comes to developing these capacities. A Notre Dame liberal arts graduate and Harvard MBA once told me within his firm interviews finalist job candidates at his firm in Texas, they give them an office, a computer, and a choice of 5 topics from which they must choose one, on which they are expected to develop an essay in 90 minutes. Liberal arts graduates, he tells me, tend to excel in this exercise, which is viewed as an essential test of thinking and of organizational and communication skills. The best way to develop such writing skills is to have students write and rewrite across the years of their curriculum. Any flagged writing course should have rewriting as at least part of its requirement. Liberal arts students also learn critical thinking and problem-solving skills, how to uncover flaws in assumptions and arguments, how to formulate meaningful questions, how to weigh contradictory and disparate evidence, and how to recognize what is of greater and lesser value. Every business needs to draw on such capacities in determining its priorities. Liberal arts students are exposed to the methods of various disciplines and so develop the capacity to be receptive to new ideas, gather diverse kinds of materials, and organize information into a coherent whole. The capacity to synthesize a broad array of ideas and data is essential for good decision-making on any issue. The college seminar I mentioned above addresses a great question that students approach by engaging classical and contemporary works in the arts, humanities, and social sciences. In my version of the course at Notre Dame, students explore the topic faith, doubt, and reason. They read works in philosophy and theology and literature. They discuss great films by directors such as Alfred Hitchcock and Woody Allen. They visit the campus art museum, and they read sociological studies of the beliefs of America's youth and analyses of politics and faith in America today. Students understand, in ways that some faculty members have forgotten, that the great questions cannot be parceled out to individual disciplines. To the extent this is done, the questions become less ambitious. Indeed, one of the greatest challenges in liberal education today is to convince faculty members of the value of transcending their disciplines and to ensure that students have the right set of courses for their developing interests. So kudos to those of you active as founders and fellows of the Cornerstone program. You have stretched to help your students with the kinds of courses they most need. When we become overly specialized, we can easily overvalue what we do since we do not see it as part of a larger puzzle. And we can no less easily become despondent since we do not see its meaning in a larger mosaic. One of the legitimate concerns we should have about an immersion in research without connecting that research to the larger framework in which it is embedded, and concerns we should have about the creation of institutions of business and engineering in developing countries as opposed to the creation of universities is the loss of a sense of the university as an institution that explores the unity of knowledge across disciplines. A goal of every university should be to help students explore the unity of knowledge. The idea of a university fosters a sense of community and shared dialogue across the disciplines. This concept of unity is the reason why the various disciplines, mathematics, science, social sciences, the arts, the humanities, also architecture, business, engineering, law, and medicine, are housed within a single institution. And it has surely animated your ideal of the integrated liberal arts. Wisdom is the ability to understand individual phenomena from the perspective of the whole. Learning that brackets a sense of the whole, and with it overarching questions, is not well suited to the cultivation of wisdom. There is a relation between part one of my talk, the intrinsic value argument, and breadth. Students who see college as only a means to an end tend to take specialized courses sooner, and they take more of them. This narrowness can be counterproductive for the long run. Steve Jobs once stated that narrowness does not lend itself to the, quote, liberal arts attitude, end of quote, that has animated Apple's success. Experience of diversity is another liberal arts value. Students who master other languages and live in a non-English speaking country receive a kind of heightened liberal arts education. In a new culture, one sees one's own country anew. One realizes how much that was taken for granted was just one way of doing things. One collects interesting alternative perspectives, and the existential motivation for learning rises in leaps and bounds. When I went to Germany as an undergraduate, everything I saw was a learning experience. I had an existential connection to everything I was learning: the history, the politics, the art, the literature, the legal system. Research tells us that students learn more when they have an existential interest in the subject, when they are passionate about it or fascinated by it, and when they are themselves active in the learning process. One of the several reasons why not only study abroad, but also undergraduate research, including senior theses, offers such a valuable learning experience. Integration of the scholarly and the existential is a path to deepen student motivation and ensure more engaged learning. Also, students who explore issues relating to age, gender, class, and ethnicity develop an appreciation for diversity and an understanding of what makes us both common and different that help them relate to others and engage people of varying backgrounds in meaningful ways. Economic research from earlier this year has shown that nearly all job growth since 1980 has been in occupations that are relatively social skill intensive. Although computers have taken over many jobs, social skills, including relating to others who are different, have become more important. Computers, after all, are still poor at simulating human interaction. An eye for complexity and a tolerance for ambiguity is another value gained in a liberal education. While some persons might believe that thinking one's way into complexities and ambiguities represents something muddled in comparison with the clarity of practical thinking, many issues are simply not reducible to an either-or dimension. Many great artworks, for example, are open to genuinely conflicting interpretations, which is a source of their continuing fascination. I've been amazed at how often liberal arts graduates who've gone on to successful business careers speak of the way in which business and life consist of the gray areas of uncertainty the unknown, where they spend most of their time and where they draw on the capacity to see an issue from multiple perspectives. A love of learning that encourages the capacity to continue to learn may be the most important capacity students develop in a liberal arts setting. Dramatic shifts in technology, cultural contexts, and market forces demand receptivity to change and innovation. A young American today with at least 2 years of college can expect to change jobs at least 11 times before retirement. Graduates who report that most of their classwork was professionally oriented have been shown to be less likely to become lifelong learners. Not unrelated, graduates who report that they took a large role in class discussions were more likely to report characteristics of lifelong learning than others. Being able to stretch into new areas is also essential for management. As managers gain higher levels of authority, their responsibilities broaden such that they must develop knowledge of new fields. Majors are less important than most people think. In a survey of employers released in 2013, nearly all employers surveyed, 93%, said that a demonstrated capacity to think critically, communicate clearly, and solve complex problems is more important than a job candidate's undergraduate major. Purdue combines in one institution the liberal arts and the professional schools. Steve Jobs has commented that, quote, technology married with liberal arts, with the humanities, yields the result that makes our heart sing, end of quote. The presence of a premier liberal arts certificate at Purdue guarantees that students pursuing a pre-professional program also have access to a broader education. Cornerstone, after all, is open to majors across the university. The combination of the professional schools and the liberal arts also ensures that foundational and normative questions are not bracketed in the teaching and research of those in applied areas. The presence of more applied disciplines keeps Purdue focused not only on issues of intrinsic value, but also on questions of wider applicability. Adding to this practical dimension is the passion for making a difference that has animated the tradition of great land-grant universities like Purdue. Pursuing the liberal arts at a land-grant university gives you the best of both worlds. A further advantage of Purdue is that you are a research university. The integration of teaching and research was at the core of the idea of the university when it was modernized in early 19th century Germany. Your Cornerstone program uses for its first-year courses only tenure track and tenured faculty, that is, faculty engaged in research. Having as teachers researchers who can bring to the classroom not only an interest in other subjects, but the most recent knowledge in their fields and the critical skills and passions of active researchers is ideal for students. Not only does research enhance teaching, teaching aids research. Our engagement with students forces us to think of the most basic principles of our fields, and excellent seminar experiences, where discussion is rich and vital, can at all levels lead to the production of new knowledge. My third chapter is called Forming Character. When the value of a liberal arts education is defended today, educators normally elevate not its intrinsic value, which is simply too foreign to contemporary culture, but critical thinking, which is essential to the Enlightenment goal of dismantling false truths. In surveys, critical thinking is always at the top in terms of the highest priorities for faculty members. In one, 99% identify the ability to think critically as very important or essential. Only a fraction of the same faculty view enhanced student self-understanding, develop moral character, or develop personal values as very important or essential. Often neglected within a culture that elevates critical thinking is formation, the goal of helping students develop virtues, build character, and gain a sense of vocation, the moral and social purpose of education. Still, many faculty are hesitant to engage personal development and moral formation. Much of the caution is understandable. The elevation of critical thinking, with its implicit suggestion that liberal education means viewing everything with a distant and disinterested eye, seems to work against the idea that what one is studying could have meaning for one's heart and soul. This is linked to the common idea that critical thinking is, as the name implies, negative. It identifies and uncovers problems. It does not itself develop tenable views. Faculty are also hesitant to address issues that take them beyond their specialized knowledge and raise complex questions of ultimate value. Faculty are uneasy with reductive versions of character development, which tend toward ready-made answers and moral and ideological indoctrination. Faculty hesitation may be further reinforced by a modesty about impinging on sensitive areas or imposing their own values on students. As understandable as this development may be, the separation of intellectual and moral explanation is ultimately untenable. As Mark Van Doren noted more than a half a century ago, quote, "The danger in separating character from intellect and asking it to operate alone is that men will then be licensed to handle moral ideas as though they were not ideas," end of quote. This amoral vision of education is also hardly in the spirit of what parents expect. As much as parents express concerns about job prospects, they genuinely want their children to become good persons, and they expect that college will help their sons and daughters develop further such that they become truly moral men and women. Many would acknowledge that residential life and extracurricular activities, including community service, help develop character. I emphasize those dimensions and agree with that argument, but they are not enough. Many intellectual pursuits presuppose virtues of character, and so the two often develop in tandem. For example, to prepare well for each class by completing all assignments, rereading materials, making appropriate notes, and reflecting thoughtfully is to elevate study over other available pleasures, and is as such an illustration of temperance. To consider that every author I study may have ideas that are worthy of my attention presupposes generosity of spirit. To recognize in the works we study insights of great value and a measure of greatness is to experience the virtue of modesty. Discussion classes test and develop many additional virtues. To listen carefully to the views of others and to weigh them honestly, even if they should contradict your initial inclinations, is to practice a form of justice. To encourage effectively the participation of others and successfully draw good ideas out of them is to exhibit intellectual hospitality. To challenge the views of interlocutors without making the attack personal, and thus without drawing their eyes away from the search for truth, is to practice diplomacy. Humility is evident whenever I recognize that I must withdraw an idea from discussion in the face of decisive counter-arguments, that I haven't myself discovered the answer, and that I must continue to listen attentively to the views of others. To hold on to a view, even against consensus, when one is convinced of its validity, is to experience social isolation for one's belief in truth and is an act of courage. The idea of a link between character and learning is not new. In Plato's dialogues, we see the ways in which ideas relate to life forms. Plato interweaves the criticism of ideas with the evaluation of persons. Individuals who are full of themselves, dogmatic and self-assured, are not likely to uncover truth. Faculty are often conflicted on the question of helping students develop as persons. Many of us do want to have a substantial impact. Little has pleased me more than a student's comment that my course keeps her up at night because she can't rest until she's thought more about the great questions we are pursuing, or the artworks we are interpreting, or a letter in which a former student thanks me for having played a formative role in her learning. Faculty want to focus on disciplinary knowledge and critical thinking, but they rejoice when they have connected with the student in a deeper and more meaningful way. Assignments can help bring out the existential and moral dimensions of education. In my college seminar, students are invited to explore their own thinking on the topics, asking such questions as, how does faith relate to reason? Is doubt potentially productive? How do we judge the validity of a religious claim? How does doubt relate to identity crises and the development of a richer identity? What role does faith play in human relationships? The majority of study questions focus on understanding the texts, evaluating their assumptions and arguments, exploring their forms, and recognizing the works in their various contexts, but the questions also address more existential interests. The answers students give may be far less important than the exercise of getting them to think about the works as being of more than simply historical or rhetorical interest. In an ideal liberal arts environment, students learn not only about works, but also from works. The final chapter, and I come to the end, is called Integrating the Values of the Liberal Arts. This chapter argues that integrating the values of the liberal arts helps students develop a sense of vocation. Developing a sense of vocation begins with great questions. In what ways does the world as it is differ from the world as it should be? What are my abilities and passions? And what specific contribution can I make to help bridge that difference? The articulation of a higher purpose, the discernment of contemporary problems, the awareness of our own capacities, and the integration of these realms for a moral purpose are well served by the breadth as well as the social and existential significance of a liberal arts education. What is of greatest value? What are the most pressing challenges of the age? Who am I? What ought I to do with my life? These questions form the core of a liberal arts education. Empirical research has verified the ancient wisdom that a focus on material and other external goods beyond a basic level is harmful to the soul. A life focused on intrinsic value, on developing one's capacities and meeting meaningful challenges, exploring ideas, deepening friendships, fostering community, tends to increase one's sense of contentment. The greatest happiness comes from absorbing yourself in some goal outside yourself. We completely lose ourselves in the purpose of our vocation. This is uncannily similar to the loss of self we experience when we are absorbed in reading a great work of literature. Both are characterized by doing something as an end in itself instead of as a means to yet some other purpose. Of course, this sense of what is valuable as an end and not simply a means is also an ethical value. It corresponds to the Kantian moral imperative that we treat others never simply as a means, but always as an end. Thank you very much. So I'm happy to take questions and comments. Yes?
Professor Roche, thank you so much for such a stimulating presentation.
My question draws a little bit on your experience as somebody who has served in a public university setting, but
Yeah.
who now hails from a large private university.
Yeah.
I'm from Christendom College, visiting in Virginia, a small private institution.
Yeah.
And one thing that I think helps the study of the liberal arts to thrive in both of our institutions is the fact that they're private. And one, for mine in particular, is that we're very small.
Yeah.
So how do we translate that into a public university setting based on your own experience? And more to the point, what things can those of us who work in private universities further in the liberal arts do to support the study of the liberal arts within the larger public universities? Are there ways that we can sort of be mutually reinforcing?
Yeah, these are great questions. You know, Aristotle says there's a quantitative limit to the polis. In a sense, there is a quantitative limit to the ideal university. If it is to be a community of learning, it cannot be beyond a certain size. Ohio State and Purdue are very large universities. But you have to deal with what is. Therefore, you have to think creatively about ways to foster community within a large university setting. My field is German. I had the advantage at Ohio State that the number of students taking German was only 2,000. And the number of majors was, of course, relatively small. We're talking fewer than 100 majors, probably closer to 50. So I articulated the ideal that within this large university, we were crafting a liberal arts college atmosphere, certainly and easily for graduate students, but also for majors and even our individual courses. You can't teach an effective language course with 40 students. So most of them, even at Ohio State, will have a cap, perhaps 25, not 18, which would be better. But even with 25, you can foster a sense of community. And you can, as an academic, foster extracurricular learning activities that are linked with your major, film evenings or coffee hours, other activities that create islands of community within a large university. I believe the Cornerstone program is such an example. And David, when he offered some opening comments, said something I very much like. Perhaps this is one of several initiatives that will emerge. I noticed you have an honors program. That's also community within the large university. So the students become part of a cohort. So one needs to find as many strategies as possible. It might involve the residential halls. Having persons in the residential halls who receive a modest stipend in order to be, let's say, the intellectual officers who foster events in the residential halls. And then don't forget, at a large state university like Purdue, you have a huge percentage, I don't know exactly what the figure is, but certainly a large percentage that are commuters. So you need to find activities for commuters so that they can get together, and they need to be at different times. You need commuter activities that are in the afternoon, commuter activities that are in the evening, because the students work various and different hours. They have various distances. So I believe we are all called upon to foster these communities, not even as administrators, but as faculty members. I'll draw up an analogy. I wrote a book, What German Universities Can Learn from the American University and What They Should Avoid. And one of the things they should learn is community, the sense of community. The Germans are not very good at it. It's one reason they have very few alumni gifts, and it's the reason why in the US, the highest percentage of alumni gifts come from to a university like Princeton. And of research universities, then comes Notre Dame and Dartmouth, all similar, smaller institutions, more undergraduate than graduate, and the liberal arts colleges, some of them, exceed even Dartmouth and Notre Dame. So we have built into our ethos a sense of community, and that falls mainly on administrators. They're charged with it. Faculty are private entrepreneurs. They tend to identify with their discipline more than their university. I'm not a fan of that. And that's why I was attracted to Notre Dame. At Notre Dame, I have a sense a good percentage of faculty members are cosmopolitans who connect with the discipline, but also locals who connect with Notre Dame. Now, the comparison with Germany. The German university does not have an ethos that community matters. So what happens? The individual faculty members create community. I'm amazed at what colleagues of mine in philosophy and German at universities that are really almost structured like airport terminals, Bielefeld, or beautiful idyllic settings in Old Bamberg, what they do with students to create communities of learning, including even going out to the pub after a smaller class. So I think we can do a lot, even at a large research university, if our ideal is such that community matters, and I think it does. Students need to get to know one another. The greatest predictor of student learning in college is the peer group. And motivation is aided by the peer group. For example, you might have heard the term undermatching. Students from underprivileged backgrounds don't know about college. They don't know that you can go to Emory or Notre Dame or Harvard and not pay a penny if you don't have any money at home. They simply don't know. So although they could be admitted to Dartmouth, they apply instead to Grand Valley State. And that's where they go. And they're less likely to graduate from Grand Valley State than they would be from Harvard because they don't have the peer group, they don't have the context of aspirations, they don't have the support structures. So prioritizing community, it doesn't cost much money. A lot of it is time, and it's fun. It's fun. And if you have graduate students, what a great way for a graduate student to add to his or her CV. I was responsible for fostering community in the political science department among newly subscribed majors. And it can be combined with intellectual activities. I started a program at Notre Dame where students who are majoring in history, let's say, were invited to read a book over the summer. And I paid for the book as dean. It cost me nothing, practically. Then they came back, they read the book over the summer, and they had a seminar with a faculty member. So what a great experience. They're becoming a cohort, they get to meet a faculty member, they do something that they chose to do. It's not required for the majors. And then the next year, the best students take over leading the class for the next generation. Well, you're already almost out of it. The faculty members can mentor and go through a little exercise, what you do. But the main thing is to awaken that intellectual curiosity, that peer community. Now, what can the private universities do to help the publics? I am a huge fan of trading best practices. There is no reason to invent the wheel when we are facing so many similar challenges. One of the things I liked the most about being at Ohio State was that we were part of the CIC, the Big Ten plus University of Chicago. Every fall, the chairpersons of German departments would go rotating to a different campus, and we would have discussions with each other. And the main value was to have a focused discussion about a challenge that we all faced in common: retaining majors beyond a certain level, retention of students beyond the language requirement, let's say, integrating continued language learning and literature at the advanced level. You name it, it's easy to come up with a challenge. So we'd spend several hours on that, and then different people would report on what's working well or what other challenges they had. It would be kind of a round robin with a back and forth. The CIC also exchanged documents. If you had to deal with a new policy from the federal government on accountability, reporting, issues of discrimination, you can see who's the leader, who has it. We don't have to reinvent it. We can look at a model and rewrite it. So I think we need more opportunities to have not only athletic consortia, but academic consortia. And there is no reason in my mind, if you bore down to the arts and sciences level or the departmental level, why they have to be of the same genre. Certainly Purdue and Ohio State and Minnesota have a lot in common, but you would be surprised how I could take a lot of what I learned at Ohio State and help Notre Dame think differently about puzzles it was facing. And some of that goes all the way back to having been an undergraduate at Williams. You have an ideal, and you know what should be done, and the more you experience different universities, the more you talk to other faculty and administrators at other universities, it really helps. That is one reason why I wrote this book, Realizing the Distinctive University. It tries to offer best practices to foster a number of ideals that I think universities should have. So I would encourage sharing of best practices. And obviously, it's great to write an op-ed for the New York Times or the Chicago Tribune, but it's not easy to be placed. But if you write an op-ed on the value of the liberal arts and can place it in the Fort Wayne paper or the Lafayette paper, they're more likely to accept it. You want to reach out one by one and influence also parents. So you can, if you are at a private university and you publish an op-ed on the value of the liberal arts, talking about perhaps the new program, maybe it's 1 year anniversary, maybe you send it in the fall when students are heading off to college. If you can do that, you are contributing to the collective mission of raising the level of the liberal arts across private and publics. Yeah.
My question is related to the research university aspect.
Yeah.
I think most of us here are on board with the sense of community that we're
Yeah.
trying to build here in the College of Liberal Arts. But since we are a research university and a university that places priority on research,
Yeah.
so can you comment maybe on, I mean, I enjoyed your best practices, your sharing of, for example, for the oral skills, the intensive work that you do with students for their final exams, and 45 minutes one-on-one and this kind of thing, but that's a tremendous time commitment. So just wondering if you could comment some more on how you're incentivizing or prioritizing for research on that faculty who are trying to balance building that sense of community and one-on-one with students with their own research agendas.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a great question. When I was dean, I hired 3 people to come in, a former president of Ivy League University, a president of a liberal arts college, and a very successful businessman to spend 2 days with me and just analyze me, interview all my others, and help me understand how I could be better. And the president of Washington Lee heard me, I shared documents with them in advance, and the faculty were concerned. This is now back 20 years. The faculty were concerned that as research standards were being elevated, the sense of community was diminishing. What could we do to address that? And I had a number of initiatives trying to address it, but he laughed and said, this is not particular to Notre Dame. This is an example of a universal challenge. Now, liberal arts colleges, depending on its rank, will have a little less expectation, but every research university that takes seriously teaching, whether you as an individual or dean or the president, will have this challenge. So what do you do? If you have resources, there are 2 immediate things you can do. One is have an incentivized leave program so that faculty can focus on their research. So at Notre Dame, I introduced 2 things that I thought made a lot of sense and skyrocketed us to #1 in the nation in NEH fellowships and did very well with other fellowships. One was, if you are going to take a leave, even at a wealthy private university, you have to submit at least 2 external applications. So that would potentially bring money into the institution. And since my budget was structured, I immediately structured that way, that every line was funded. If a faculty member went on leave, I had money for that faculty member. Now let's say an NEH grant came in. Let's say it's $60,000. I gave $30,000 to the department and said, that's for you to play with, to staff replacements. If you can economize, you can use that for student activities, for research projects, whatever. So it was an incentive system. So if somebody were on leave with an NEH, the department benefited. So it was win-win for the faculty member and for the department. I took 50%, and I used it for various initiatives. The faculty member kept his or her regular salary and had the year off at full pay, but turned over the fellowship money to me. And I split it 50-50 with the department. So it's a great incentive. And I think if you really want to do both well, as a faculty member, you need to think strategically about ways to maximize your time not teaching. I don't mean by that getting out of teaching so that you never teach. I mean teaching your normal load, being fully engaged, but knowing this isn't going to go on for 10 years without a break. And a faculty who could get an NEH and a Guggenheim, they could take leaves fairly often. They didn't have to wait the 6 years. The other thing you can do also requires some resources, this even more so, is decrease class size. That helps learning, but it also helps your correcting. So if you want students to rewrite and write a lot and give them feedback, it's much easier with a class of 16 or 18 than it is with 30. So that's another piece of the puzzle. Those are two dimensions. I also think it's very important that every level of the university leadership be honest about the criteria for promotion and tenure and salary increases. When I arrived at Notre Dame, I had a modest sense that we had pushed too far toward research so that teaching was being a little bit neglected. Not dramatically so, but enough that I was concerned. And I made it clear to faculty they would go down either with poor teaching or poor research. And I began every promotion and tenure letter, I had to write 40 a year, begin everyone with teaching. And the faculty knew that. That was a way of saying this still matters. And I counted things like contributions to the integrated program. Things like that would count as a plus because you are stretching, it's costing you more time. So if the incentives are there in some way. And then we introduced incentives for faculty. When I arrived at Notre Dame, some faculty were teaching in the summer session. I found that bizarre. Their salaries were good enough. They shouldn't be teaching to get extra money. They should be doing their research. And I introduced, didn't cost a lot of money, grants of, say, $3,500 if they were to design a new course that I wanted to incentivize. So, for example, at Notre Dame, I had a course development grant program for courses that would link a particular discipline with the Catholic mission of the university. So a new art history course that might have a lot more to do with the Catholic tradition of the arts than in the past. Or before we introduced the college seminar, I sensed the importance of oral skills. So I had grants for oral intensive teaching. So these are a couple of things. I also am of the view you can strategize on your time teaching. My first semester at Notre Dame, I took a workshop called Teaching Well, Saving Time. And I liked the title, and I liked the session. It basically said, first thing you want to do is articulate the learning goals for the course. Because anything you're doing in the course that doesn't direct itself toward the learning goals is wasted time. Then this strategy that Patrick mentioned, where you try and increase student discussion. It can be actually more of a time saver than preparing an elaborate lecture. I tell the story in the liberal arts book, somewhat funny, that we were selling our house on Amazon Place in Clintonville, Ohio. And my wife was working full-time. And she called at 9 in the morning and said, someone's going to look at the house. The realtor will be there at 5:30. I'll meet the realtor, but you have to clean the house. And this happened to be a day where I'd cut my class preparation a little short. I try not to do that, but I did. These were poems by Friedrich Hölderlin that I knew well, more or less, and I thought I could do it in the course of a day. At 3 o'clock, I started teaching. Well, I couldn't prepare like I normally do. Not only that, but a half hour later, I get a call from an associate professor, Harry Fredefeld, who says, I see I'm supposed to visit your class this semester. Would today be a good day? Yes, of course, Harry. Please come today. Meanwhile, I'm cleaning up the house and putting the laundry away and doing all kinds of things, nervous as could be. I got into class. I don't think I've ever been as unprepared as that day. What happened? It was one of the best classes I ever taught. Why? I had very little prepared to contribute. So I had to think out loud, drawing on what the students said, in order to wind it together, connect it to the text. Now, I knew the text, and I'd read them X number of times, but I didn't have the full amount of time to process the rereading and the review of notes, so I had to be completely there. So in some ways, it was a lesson to me that a good class doesn't always mean over-preparing. Sometimes you over-prepare so you feel you need to get all this in, where the students really need something else. So I think there are creative strategies. Yeah. In the back. Well, I would. Yeah, actually, being in Germany is an experience of diversity. Being in China is an experience of diversity. Yeah, you'll recall the next paragraph. I mentioned experiences with persons of different backgrounds. And yeah. Yeah. I would put it this way. If persons of certain backgrounds are underrepresented in a discipline or in an initiative, one needs to find strategies to bring more in. And one needs to think about both what will bring them in, what will attract them, how one can bring more over time into it, and how one can address specific challenges that a particular group might face. So I think I use the phrase at Notre Dame, diversity, not affirmative action. Why? When you're talking about faculty at a very wealthy private university, to hire someone away from Duke who's already making a significant six-figure salary is not really the same kind of affirmative action as bringing a first-generation college student into college. You are simply moving someone around. However, diversity plays a role because you want students in the classroom to experience different role models. And you want persons in the classroom to be able to draw on not only their intellectual background, but their personal background, because the experiences they have, the stories they have to tell, what they encountered in terms of circumstances, adversity, etc., will also inform that discussion. So the goal is absolutely legitimate to try and bring in as many people who are underrepresented in a particular group. And what kind of incentives exist? If you find that you aren't aware of enough such scholars, give you an example of something I did at Notre Dame. I had a special fund for younger scholars who were already assistant professors, who were either women or represented diversity. Departments had an incentive to get funds to bring them to Notre Dame, to add to the intellectual environment, because we didn't have enough women, we didn't have enough persons of color. So there was an incentive there to bring them. They were also potential future hires. That was one of the aspects of it. So you need to find ways to bring them in. You also need to address with the particular challenges they face. And here, because our culture is such that even among educated persons, women do more housework than men. Women have greater obligations at home than men. One needs to find ways to give them opportunities where they can save resources. So daycare centers, opportunities where there are incentives if someone wants to stay late. They can drop their child off somewhere. That is going to help women more than men, I think. And such activities seem valuable to me if they lighten the load. We had an incentive at Notre Dame where faculty could come together either to discuss intellectual issues. So we had a group across disciplines who discussed ancient philosophy, but also other issues, cultivating faculty-student contact, or facing challenges of balancing work and life. Activities like that involve sharing best practices are ways to help persons flourish when they're taking on new activities. So I would answer in that way. Yeah.
So when you were talking about forming character and morality and virtue
Yeah.
in the classroom, that really struck a chord with me because as an undergraduate and then through graduate school, I have felt myself change and my character change as I've read texts, as I've had conversations with my peers, as I've had interactions with my mentors, all of that. And yet I find that when I write my own syllabi, I am very hesitant to write that one of the goals of the classes is to help shape character or anything to do with morality. And I'm not sure if this is more a high school issue or it's also a college issue, but I worry myself, and the reason I hesitate is that it's sort of presumptuous, that I will have an impact on your character rather than simply educating you, and that the student comes into the classroom thinking, my character's already been developed, you're just here to give me information. So can you sort of speak to maybe how we can approach that subject without seeming presumptuous or
Yeah.
or overcoming this sort of fear that faculty might have, because you said that faculty are hesitant to do that.
Yeah. I would do it in two ways. The first way is to phrase the learning goals such that the material they learn will not, you don't quite phrase it this way, but you don't present it as this is objective, dry stuff that you're learning. This is fascinating material that you will find existentially engaging. It will address you as a person, not only a developing intellectual or scholar. To make it existentially significant actually aids their learning. So you phrase it that way as an invitation to them to think about the material as being material that will help them develop as persons. You leave it fairly open. You're giving them categories, questions, strategies to connect what they're learning with who they are. That's the first. And so I would do that. And then with the various assignments, occasional question. Now, some of the questions I gave for Faith, Doubt, and Reason would not apply at a public university, but you can imagine any number of courses where it would apply. The second is, you remember when I was talking about the third chapter, that is forming character, I talked about virtues such as intellectual hospitality, diplomacy, courage, modesty. Those are ones that you demand in the classroom for a meaningful intellectual exchange. They are not out of bounds. Students must develop them in order to be good interlocutors in a discussion. That is your terrain. And Patrick said, how do you weigh whether someone has wonder or whether someone has enacted justice? Well, I have some pretty elaborate criteria for my grading. And one of the issues I'm concerned about is grade inflation. So if you look at my syllabi, which are on the web, I begin by describing the B grade. And the student reads that and says, well, if I am able to connect comments from multiple students in order to synthesize them and bring it to a higher level, I can get a B. So you describe the kinds of things you'd like to see in a discussion that involve these various virtues. And then I go to A and say, this is even more than a B grade, then C and D. And D might have an unwillingness to listen to alternative perspectives, to engage other views. That is an intellectual deficit that also has to do with character and virtue in my eyes. The Faith, Doubt, and Reason class works great because the first work we read is Plato's Euthyphro, which is very much about the link between character and the capacity to discern knowledge. So it's thematized right away. And in the first class, especially since this might be something they're not used to, I thematize these things. I highlight items in the syllabus that they might not be used to. And I try and motivate them by saying, look, there's this job outlook annual survey, communication skills are important, and you'll only learn if I set high standards and tell you where you need to develop, but I'll support you by giving you that kind of feedback. And then I might mention something to the effect that in our discussion, you need to be able to engage views that are contrary to yours without making it personal, by using arguments. These are, it strikes me, it's almost bizarre that we have decoupled the two. I understand it. I had that paragraph where I said, I understand it. But in the long run, they are connected, as Plato already knew. Perhaps one more? Yeah, go ahead.
Examples that you've given have all been from research-intensive institutions.
Yeah.
And out of all the 4,000 plus institutions of higher learning,
Yeah.
community colleges, the research-intensive is not the norm.
Right.
Because in fact, it is regional comprehensive.
Yeah.
Universities as well as community colleges. So the examples here actually in some ways don't necessarily translate. So I would like you to just maybe address these questions about, for instance, many of my colleagues are here from Purdue Northwest, and we're 70% first-generation college students. And so these are students who are not privileged. They are not coming from households where the university is discussing. You touched on this, but it also is a different model because again, these are teaching intensive rather than research intensive. And teaching intensive are the majority of the institutions in the United States.
Yeah, of course that's correct. But I would say a majority of the privates are actually religious in nature. So some of this, the values part would certainly apply. But you're right about the different structures at different institutions. And I think one of the most important skills of a faculty member is to understand the goals and ethos of the institution where you are working. And if it's teaching intensive, then obviously you let the research behind and you focus more on teaching. And if it's first generation college students, you pitch it in a different way. But I would say there are commonalities even then. You are helping students learn to express themselves in oral and written language. That is common. The starting point might be different, but you are still going through the same formal strategies to help them learn the various formal skills I discussed. You are also awakening in them a sense of wonder about questions that might engage them that they never thought about before, or if they'd thought about it, perhaps their parents said no. If they have soccer skills, the parents will get them on a team. But if they ask interesting questions and the parents aren't responsive, you kick it out of them. Reawaken that. It's in everyone. One of the points I make in the book is you can get an ideal liberal arts education at a liberal arts college, but a liberal arts education is something everyone wants. You might not have gone to college. You might be 65 years old, but there are questions that animate you, that interest you. So this is common. It's just a matter of how you pitch it. And I would always try and pitch high. And sure, it's ideal, as I said, and it was partly a gesture to Purdue, partly a gesture to Notre Dame. It is ideal if the faculty member at the front of the classroom is also a researcher. But it's certainly possible to teach good writing and to awaken interest in great questions and to interpret a work if you're not actively engaged in research. I mean, you can do it, and the students will be more responsive. If you're able to get excited about it, so you mimic the passion of an active researcher. If we were to address this in a new way, how would we go about it? So I think they're analogous, even if they're different. Is that fair?
Well, I want to clarify one very important point.
Okay.
That if you are a faculty member at a teaching intensive university or college, you are still engaged in scholarship. Yes.
That's great.
And if you are at a community college, and many community colleges, you have to publish your tenure.
Yeah, then it's even more similar. Very good. Very good. So that suggests they're intertwined even more than I took from your question.
I think we should
Yeah.
close off. I
Yeah.
think we should thank our speaker.
Thank you.